Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's now 15:45 and time to resume the hearing sessions. We concluded on matter 6 just before the break, so I'm intending to move on to matter 7 now, which relates to the economy and policy 6 in particular. I think it's probably worth just setting out at this stage that I don't intend to revisit anything that we covered under matter 2 last week in terms of the more strategic elements of the plan's approach to the economy. And instead, the discussion today will focus on policy 6 and the various criteria and wording it contains. Okay. The first question related to, under this issue, related to the definition of employment uses, and in particular the relationship there with the introduction of Class E. I've seen the partnership's response to this point and the proposed modification to the definition of employment land in the glossary and monitoring framework, which I would support, and that should be added to the list of main modifications. But whilst that change in definition is helpful, I think what I was driving at with this question in particular was how the partnership would control any new office or light industrial consents on employment allocations or within existing employment areas under Class E G to ensure that they didn't subsequently change to another Class E use. Response on that point would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Phil Morris here. We're representing the partnership on this matter. The control will be through conditions, I imagine. That's how traditionally there has been control. In my experience, conditions have been applied to developments of what were A-class uses, retail uses, within the class itself, to condition to bulky goods, or to condition to food retailing, or to condition to non-food. And those conditions are typically used because the type of development will impact on issues such as impact on centres, so in retail impact in that case. It makes a big difference to the transport measures that are required to access a site. So I don't see that the introduction of a different use class changes that standard way of approaching these matters. And that's why I think it's in the supporting text rather than the policy, but we refer to the need to make sure that conditions are applied to ensure the development takes place in accordance with the evidence that's been supplied. If someone wants to go to the expense of providing evidence for retail, but doesn't intend to provide it, then that will be up to, within their gift to do so.
Can you just draw my attention to the section of the explanatory text you're referring to there, Mr. Morris? That would be helpful. Thank you.
Yes, it's I'm going to struggle to find it now. Yes, it's the final sentence of paragraph 298, which says that in addition, large-scale out-of-centre office, retail, or leisure development will have significant implications, for example, for traffic generation, and it will be important to ensure through conditions that the development that takes place is consistent with the evidence provided with the planning application.
Okay. I think the obvious way of controlling it is through conditions. You can condition changes within a use class. Obviously, Class E is a very broad use class, and it could be conditioned at the planning approval stage to require that. I suppose I was thinking a bit beyond that, in the sense that if you were to do that and apply those conditions, it's quite likely you'd find yourself being challenged at some point on that basis, given the breadth of Class E and the flexibility the government intended to introduce when it was brought in. So I suppose the point I was driving at in that sense was, would it be worth having a additional clause in the policy to strengthen your position in that situation and to explain the reasons why conditions would be sought for particularly office consents? That's the issue, isn't it? It's because they fall within Class E, which has that broader ambit. And so wording along the lines of, in order to prevent the proliferation of town centre uses in out of centre or edge of centre locations, conditions will be used to restrict permissions granted for office, light industrial, research and development uses under Class EG from being changed to other uses within Class E. We're wording along those lines, and that might strengthen the position. I don't know what your thoughts are on that point.
I would welcome those changes. That's fully in line with what we're trying to achieve here.
That's what I thought. I'm aware from colleagues working on local plans elsewhere that that's been an approach that's been used in order to address some of the conundrums thrown up by Class E. And I think that would assist in delivering what you're hoping to achieve. There's a related point there as well, because not only does Class E provide flexibility within Class E, there's also fairly generous PD rights attached to it as well. And it occurred to me that, particularly on allocations, and perhaps this is a point we return to with the discussion about allocations and the detailed policies that relate to them. If you're relying on those allocations to deliver your strategy, you might wish to prevent major office developments on those allocations from being able to convert to residential within 2 years, which is my understanding that the current Class MA within the use classes order allows Class E uses. I mean, it used to be when it was Class O prior to the formulation of Class E that I think there was a base date to which the building had to be in office use. I think it was somewhere in 2013, which was there to, the intention there was to prevent people developing offices subsequently and then immediately changing into housing. Yeah. I think my understanding is that Class MA, which applies to Class E, changes of use from Class E to residential is on a rolling 2-year basis, so it has to have been in use for 2 years. Which would mean that if you were to grant, for example, an office development, one of your allocations, say in 6 months' time, it was built out in 6 months, then in 3 years it could feasibly be changed to a housing scheme. It might be a point to return to when we discuss the policies that apply to the allocations, but it's just something to think about while we're discussing the implications of Class E, really.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. I think I've lost my place again. Here we go. Okay, question 2. That's all I wanted to raise under the issue of Class E. Are there any other comments from around the room on that matter before we move on to the second question under this issue? Okay. The second question really relates to one of the caveats that's applied in the section under the town centres heading. It's that paragraph that comes in after point 4, and it's the final sentence of it. So it says, development should seek to enhance the environment and the economy of centres and of villages with more dispersed services to protect their function, to avoid the loss of commercial premises or local services. It's that last section there, loss of commercial premises or local services, that I picked up, and I think some of the representations picked up as well. I've seen the partnership's response to that point in the hearing statement, which suggests replacing commercial uses, which obviously it lacks a clear planning definition, with main town centre uses. And whilst that would be clearer, it would also capture a fairly wide range of uses, including pubs, bars, restaurants, hotels, and bingo halls even. And there seemed to be, to me at least, a bit of a disconnect between this requirement here compared to the narrow restrictions in policy 7.1, which we discussed last week, in which sought to restrict the loss of office spaces only, rather than the wider range of town centre uses. So the question firstly is what's the reason for that apparent difference in approach? Thank you.
I think it's not the best choice of wording that we've used. The intention behind that part of the policy is to try to retain activity. But it's not trying to retain specific uses necessarily, or like for like in terms of quantum. The idea behind it is within any new developments or redevelopments to try and maintain activity to support the vitality and viability of the centre. So that was the intention. And as I say, maybe we've not used the best form of words in trying to achieve that.
And when you say activity, do you mean at shopfront level?
Yes, essentially. Yeah. Yes. So it's maintaining the trip attracting uses, and clearly, if you've got a redundant building with that's more suited to a conversion above ground floor, then that would be still retaining an active frontage, which is the important thing. And again, we're not being we're not saying it has to be an active frontage. The point is retaining activity, trip attracting uses that support vitality and viability.
So the key aim is trip attracting uses at ground floor level, and you, for example, you'd be less concerned with apartments at first floor and above say a ground floor shop. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
Okay. And what about in more secluded parts of a designated centre? I mean, the detailed boundaries obviously are set in the lower order plans. I'm just thinking of examples I'm more familiar with elsewhere, where you'll have it, for example, a district centre boundary within which you'll have traditionally identified your retail frontages, but you would also have had back alleys, areas that perhaps don't get an awful lot of footfall, more backland and less prominent locations within that centre. So is the aim to protect the more important routes and frontages within those centres from being lost to I mean, active frontages was often the phrase that was used for a while. The aim to you don't have a dead frontage during the day. Is that the aim?
I think that yes, that is a significant part of the story. In the policy, in the part of the policy that is concerning you, we do refer to the function of the centre. So I think it's the centre as a whole. We would want to make sure that development didn't detract more than is necessary, given current circumstances, to the overall function of the centre. So where you describe backland, back alleys that may not contribute greatly to the function, then that wouldn't be controlled or would be consistent with this policy.
Okay.
I think we're trying to be as flexible as we can, but as I say, with the ultimate aim of maintaining vitality and viability of centres.
Okay, I mean that's helpful to understand the thought process behind it. I think my concern would be then that the terminology that's used, particularly seeking to resist the loss of all town centre uses, and to resist, seemingly as a blanket statement, the loss of commercial premises, or even main town centre premises. I don't know if that paints with too broad a brush, given the aims you were shooting at, really. And that's with those backland areas, above ground floor issues. Yeah. It's one for you to reflect on, but my concern would be, perhaps unintentionally, the wording at present seems to be highly restrictive, and it seems to be more so than the aims you've just set out. I don't know if you think that's a fair comment or not.
I think it's very fair. I think it's very fair. We're content to go away and try and write something that is more reflective of what we're trying to achieve. Okay. I think the idea is that Western Homes have put forward a modification, and while I don't think it's entirely suitable, I think it's the direction of travel that we need to be taking with a modification.
Okay. There's a couple of hands up around the room. Miss Wright, you were up first. Do you wish to come in?
Thank you, sir. I shall keep my video off just to ensure you can hear me. Is the audio okay?
The audio is fine, yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. A couple of points. I think there could be a little bit more clarity, or I'll start off with the final paragraph. If you go through the entire policy, it starts off, it's very clear in terms of what it states and what it permits, but it isn't consistent with paragraph 84 of the NPPF in terms of the rural economy, which paragraph 84A says, with regards to supporting a prosperous rural economy, planning policies and decisions should enable the sustainable growth and expansion of all types of businesses in rural areas, both through the conversion of existing buildings and well-designed new buildings. When we look at our currently drafted policy, the first part of it says sufficient employment land is allocated. I won't go through the rest. The second says the need of small and medium startup businesses are addressed through these means, and it states how. The third says large-scale needs are addressed, so it's telling you what's happening. Then the fourth says land identified for employment uses in this local plan will not be considered for other uses. The fifth deals with tourism and leisure, and so on. The sixth says opportunities for innovation, skills, and training will be expanded through facilitating the expansion of and access to vocational, further and higher education provision. And then we look at town centres, and it says key strategic employment areas are identified as follows. Then beneath the town centres heading, there is the final paragraph, which perhaps needs its own heading because it's not to do with town centres, but it's indented as if it were part of the same policy. It says, and that's the only place it addresses rural enterprise and prosperous rural economies, where it says small scale retail and leisure developments. And again, it's only focused on retail and leisure. So where does the policy address agricultural diversification or other rural enterprise? There's nowhere in the plan, and this is the only policy that deals with strategically such developments. And I cannot see how a rural enterprise could be developed, referring to this policy, providing guidance, nor can I see how existing settlements would be encouraged to become more viable by introducing new employment uses, because where it says new employment uses will be encouraged, it says to serve new residential developments. So what about existing residential developments that could benefit from new employment uses? I think the policy is a little bit ineffective if it doesn't address rural enterprise a little bit more effectively, particularly in the final paragraph, which is the only room to maneuver where these sorts of developments are concerned. Just something for consideration, please, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Wright. And I recall you mentioning that sort of point, I think, in the discussion about the essay. I think it's an important point, but just in terms of structuring the discussion, I think I probably want to focus the discussion for now on the town centres part of the policy. And then if we can come on to that and have a discrete discussion about it afterwards, I think that might make for a slightly cleaner discussion, if that's okay. But we will come back to that in a while, if that's okay. If we can, it's just purely in terms of structuring the discussion. Mr. Watts, did you want to come in?
Yes, thank you, sir. So Chris Watts of CPW Planning, representing Western Homes and Columbia Threadneedle Investments in relation to their land interest Angular Square. So yeah, thank you, Mr. Morris, for the clarification about the main town centre use modification. I agree with the inspector that I think this is still overly restrictive, and I think at face value it's clearly a restriction on town centre development involving the loss of or replacement main town centre uses. So clearly there'll be instances, not least Angular Square, where the loss of offices, main town centre uses, would be justified given they're redundant or economically unviable to bring back into effective use. So I'd be worried about that, and also the latest Avison Young evidence base, retail evidence base, clearly talks about reduced demand for retail uses, and to a lesser extent, reduced demand for leisure and other town centre uses. So that's the B39. Yeah, it's the B39 examination document. So that talks about reduced demand for main town centre uses, and it also talks about well, it recommends a shift away from these quantitative measures related to what should be supported by the councils, and a shift towards more qualitative factors. So clearly a replacement premises involving main town centre uses would provide more modern accommodation, more flexible accommodation, and that would clearly have a more positive impact on the health of a locality than redundant or outdated premises. So I've got some further thoughts in terms of how the policy could be amended in the light of this main town centre use change, but be helpful to hear back from the partnership first, probably.
Thank you, Mr. Watts. And I've seen your representation. I've got it up in front of me now in terms of the suggested amendments to the latter section we're discussing in the elements. I'll take a response from Mr. Morris in the first instance. Thank you.
Yes, I was under the impression that the changes that we'd discussed with you, Mr. Hatfield, were entirely in accordance with what Mr. Watts is seeking. It's clearly not the intention of this policy to prevent the reasonable redevelopment of Anglia Square. And the intention of the policy in terms of Anglia Square would be to ensure that it still served a useful function as a district centre. That doesn't stop changes within that. Doesn't stop new uses being put in. It doesn't stop uses being redeveloped for better quality. It wouldn't stop the removal of an office block that probably doesn't have a lawful use anyway because it's been vacant for 30 years. So I think, I'm hoping Mr. Watts is worrying unnecessarily, but maybe I'm misreading the situation. Okay.
Well, we did discuss before potentially rewording. It's particularly that very short section which says avoid the loss of commercial premises or local services.
Yeah.
If you're open to reviewing and revisiting that, then I think that's the way forward. One other question I had, and it may be superfluous if it was going to go, is it wasn't clear to me what local services would constitute in that policy wording, and so what was being protected.
I think it was because we used the term commercial premises, so it's the other types of town centre uses that aren't commercial, so libraries, museums, those kind of activities that are not commercial in that sense. So yes, that would go along with the other wording to put something in that's more suited.
Okay. That's been a helpful. Mr. Leader, your hand's gone up. Do you wish to come
in? Thank you, sir. Peter Luder from representing Western Homes in respect of Anglia Square. My only point is it's encouraging to hear Mr. Morris's comments. I just think that in view of the history of Anglia Square having been through a call-in inquiry and the Secretary of State having identified that there were various policies with which the scheme did not comply, we are very anxious this time to demonstrate that the scheme is policy compliant, and therefore we would urge Mr. Morris, when you're reviewing this policy as you proposed, can you make it as clear as possible that, for example, the removal of an office building at Anglia Square is not contrary to the policy, because there is an argument that yes, one of the buildings hasn't been used for many decades, but office use was its last use. So, there are people that might take the view that actually the new policy is protecting it from demolition. So really, my point is simply that your aspirations, which seem on the same line as what we're aiming to do, need to be as clear as possible, effectively.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Luder. I would say, Mr. Morris, that in relation to policies 2 and 3, where I had a number of very detailed comments to make about suggested changes, we said at that stage that if it would assist you then we'd be happy to have sight of a draft version.
Okay, thank you very much. Yep.
And that's in light of the detailed remarks, detailed comments that we've put to you, particularly myself. Okay, I think we've probably covered that point now. Then, from my perspective, unless there are any other final comments. I mean, there's one other thing, just from Mr. Watts's perspective. I see there's a second amendment suggested to this that section, which relates to removing the out-of-centre impact assessment from the first sentence and inserting a new section relating to proposals for retail and leisure development outside main centres will also be subject to the impact test as defined by government policy. Was that what your hand was raised to discuss, Mr. Watts?
Yes, thank you, sir. I mean, it's not directly relevant to Anglia Square, not least because it's a town centre in NPPF terms. But I think just to make that policy clear and effective, it needs to distinguish between the two the impact test and the sequential test, because they look at different things. The impact test only concerns retail and leisure development, whereas the sequential test should apply to all main town centre uses.
And in your view, is the policy as worded potentially confusing matters in that regard, or muddying the waters?
I would say so necessarily, yes, because I think it's the first paragraph of the town centre section talks about a requirement for the sequential approach and impact assessment for all main town centre uses. But clearly the impact test only relates to retail and leisure, and that's set out in the NPPF.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Morris, that's perhaps another point to reflect on in having a look at this policy again. Absolutely,
sir. And I can see how it reads differently to the way we read it. The link to as defined by government policy and guidance was meant to enable that differentiation between impact and sequential approaches to be seen. But I take Mr. Watts's point that it's not entirely clear. So to make it clearer, we would happily, I think, probably just adopt the form of words that he's suggested. But certainly something very similar, because, yeah, we entirely agree with the point. It wasn't our intention to suggest that office development needed an impact assessment.
Okay, thank you. Okay, are there any final comments on question 2 then, before we address the point Ms. Wright raised earlier about the support for rural businesses and farm diversifications, etc.? Okay. The point Ms. Wright raised then, Mr. Morris, I think the critique is, if I recall it accurately, was that the policy isn't supportive enough of smaller scale rural employment uses, farm diversification schemes, etc. Rural enterprises and the like. Do you have a response to that point, please? Oh, sorry, Mr. Morris, you're on mute, sorry.
Sorry about that. The first point I make is one I think I made under policy, or matter 2 rather, which is that the district councils determine rural employment opportunities under their development management policies, and I gave an example of one recently, a large scheme, actually a 4.5 hectares scheme, just outside Wyndham, next to Goffs Petroleum, where there's a resolution to permit, subject to sorting out Section 33 matters. So, that was determined in accordance with existing policies and the existing development management policies. So, that's part of the answer. The turning to the policy in the GNLP, Ms. Wright went through it paragraph by paragraph. Well, paragraph 2 is about small, medium and start-up businesses, and it talks about the allocation and retention of smaller scale employment sites across the area, across the plan area, that would include rural parts of it, with limited expansion where this can be justified. So there is a rural element to that part, and then the next bullet down is the commercial appropriate use of rural buildings. So that's a reuse of existing buildings. Then we move down. I think Ms. Wright, she raised the final paragraph of the policy, which only applies to retail and leisure, but there's again another element of rural opportunity there. So I think between the development management policies and this policy, it is covered. It's certainly something we would not seek to discourage. So I'm content that the policy covers the matter, but if I'm misreading the policy and it could be made clearer, then I think we'd happily consider that.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Wright, did you wish to respond to that point?
Thank you, sir. Yes, I would. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Morris. So you said we would have to look to DM policies to find the guidance for what the strategic direction that the policy 6 is going to be taking us to in the future, because presumably the application you refer to determined under the current DM policies, if when the new local plan is in place, those current policies presumably would be superseded by the new local plan.
Mr. Morris, did you want to respond to those points?
No, the DM policies are not superseded by this plan, and I wasn't suggesting that you would look to them for the strategic direction, but they do provide a path for bringing forward schemes. Is the point I was trying to make? Small scale rural schemes. I mean, clearly we can't allocate through this plan every small scheme for rural employment. So, those are dealt with on a case-by-case development management basis. But as I say, if the inspectors consider that there's not enough in this to support rural enterprise, then we do not want to stand in the way of rural enterprise. But we thought it was covered.
Okay, Ms. Wright, what would you consider would need to change about the policy as currently worded in order to assuage your concerns?
Okay, so I think Mr. Morris identified them. It is paragraph 2 and the final paragraph. So paragraph 2, which currently the second bullet he refers to, Mr. Morris refers to, which says that the needs of small, medium and startup businesses are addressed through encouraging the provision of small-scale business opportunities in all significant residential and commercial developments, and through the appropriate use of rural buildings. So if we had a scenario where there was an existing say Class E development which needed regeneration and in a rural context, this policy doesn't address such scenarios adequately, but also the final paragraph I do think needs to come out of under the heading of town centres, because it's not related to town centres. So the indentation here, it needs a separate heading because it is read as part of the town centres policy, but it's also limiting that it's only referring to the scale of retail and leisure developments, and no other employment developments are referred to in this part of the policy, which is the only part of the policy that allows for developments that might occur outside of the town centre or identified allocations. The rest of the policy simply refers to identified allocations or town centre uses. So if a farmer or other rural business owner we're looking to put a development forward, there's no strategic guidance on where that development is best sited or how it might be addressed by this policy.
I take the point about the final sentence, which does sit uneasily within the town centres heading, and that's really a very minor change. Could rectify that. What about Mr. Morris's point that this matter is addressed in policies in lower order plans? In your view, are those inadequate, presumably?
Well, the lower order plans are looking with the elements of detail of how the developments might be considered once the scheme is defined. It doesn't deal with the locational requirements of such developments. So it doesn't guide you as to where would be most appropriate to site a development of a particular nature, which is where you would, if you were considering where you might site a particular development and looking at the principle of that development in a particular location, you would come to this policy, not the DM policy. If you had a site already identified and you were designing a proposal and wanting to understand what the design requirements are for that development, you might go to the DM policy, but you wouldn't go to the DM policy to find out where you might locate a development. You would come to that strategic policy, which is insufficient in an agricultural or rural context.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Morris, do you want to respond to what's been said?
Yes, sir. Ms. Wright's first point, where she referred to paragraph 2 and the second bullet in paragraph 2, I think the first bullet also applies to this situation where you've got I think the situation she described was an existing business needing to be redeveloped or expand. Well, that I think is covered by that first bullet, where it talks about smaller scale employment sites across the area with limited expansion where this can be justified. So we have some quite large employment sites, which is why we need to refer to limited expansion, because we wouldn't want to see some of them have a significant expansion of a site in the middle of nowhere. As regards the locational guidance within the DM policies, I'm not sure what locational guidance is required. This is about providing for small-scale rural enterprise. In general terms, in very general terms, anywhere within the rural area is the starting point for a rural enterprise, and then through other policies of this plan or normal development management approaches, the local issues about access or connections or those kind of things, design, they are all covered by DM. And I can only come back to, rural businesses, rural employment sites get permission through the development management process.
And which of the policies under which they gain permission? Could you draw my attention to those in the lower order plans?
I'd have to dig them out. So I think they're more developed in South Norfolk than they are in Broadland.
Okay, I mean I've got those in the examination library, so I can refer to those. I'll allow Ms. Wright to come back one more time, and then we'll have a final comment from Mr. Morris before we close. Ms. Wright.
Thank you, sir. I think given the way the discussion is going, I think if we can at least deal with the last paragraph being isolated from town centres, and then with regards to retail and leisure developments, I think could we not just say new employment developments rather than retail and leisure in the final paragraph? So it deals with any type of enterprise rather than just a retail enterprise or a leisure enterprise, so that the policy is a little bit broader in its scope.
So it would read something along the lines of small scale retail, leisure and employment developments rather than just retail and leisure? Yes, please, sir. Okay. Do you have any thoughts on that suggestion, Mr. Morris?
Only relatively positive ones. I think we're happy to take that away and have a look at it and make sure it doesn't cut across anything else. But I think the intention is to encourage rural enterprise, so I don't see that will cause us a problem by adding that in. I think the paragraph is where it is because currently it does refer to what are town centre uses, although in this case it's not talking about town centres, it's talking about those town centre uses. So that was why it is where it is, but moving it further up and considering adding a reference to employment, yeah, I don't see that's a major issue, but we can take it away and have a look.
I mean, if that accords with the approach you were aiming for, then obviously it's in revisiting this policy, that's something to consider perhaps. As I've mentioned, you've already signalled your intention to revisit some elements of this policy, and as I've said, we're myself and Mr. Warden are happy to have a first glance at any of those.
Okay, thank you. It's been drawn to my attention that the South Norfolk DM policy, the particular one to look at, is DM2 in their development management plan. That would be one of the policies that was used to determine this site I have mentioned a few times. Okay,
thank you. Okay, I think I've heard everything I need to hear on those points. It's been a helpful discussion from all the participants on this policy, so thank you very much for your contributions. That pretty much wraps up today. Annette, unless there's anything else that we need to pick up on.
Not at all, thank you.
Okay, in which case then matter 7 is concluded, and we've made good time today, and we'll reconvene tomorrow morning to discuss the East Norwich site. Okay, thank you to all concerned. See you tomorrow. That's right.